Clay Odell here for LateralTraumaPosition.org. This video looks at a technique to put a patient from supine to lateral trauma position on a Combi-Carrier. Then we're going to transfer it to an ambulance cot. What we think works best is to log roll the patient up and onto one half of the Combi-Carrier. We place the half of the Combi-Carrier on the patient's left side about 3 or 4 inches out. That way the midline of the torso, with the patient lying on their side, is in the middle of the gap. Now, one of the quirks we found with the Combi-Carrier caused us to line the patient up differently for the lateral trauma position than the supine position. So we're going to place the patient lower to make sure they get all of their torso in the gap. We're going to use the bottom of the topmost handhold as a landmark and line that up with the top of the shoulder. Next, we bring the other half of the Combi-Carrier and we place it in position. An option you may choose to use is to place a draw sheet. It might not be necessary for a small patient like this, but for a patient who's larger and whose, shall we say, excess flesh might get caught pulling the two halves together, having a draw sheet to pull on is really useful. The key is to really shove it under the patient, which doesn't really get done optimally here. Proceed with a log roll, with the person maintaining the C-spine calling the shots. Then the other half of the Combi-Carrier is put together. It's engaged at the top first, and then the draw sheet should be pulled out. Now, we win no style points for this example, but you do get the idea. Next, the bottom of the Combi-Carrier is latched, and this is where your draw sheet might be of help. Then we're going to pad the patient's head to maintain the spinal alignment. We experimented with quite a few adults, and we found that 2 bath blankets, which is about 2 inches, worked. You may need to add or subtract based on your patient's size. Now, before we lift, we put a folded bath blanket where the patient's head's going to go. The Combi-Carrier is at least 1 inch thick, so we want to compensate for that when we remove it. Now, the plan is to lift from the ends. The patient's legs are probably going to hang over the end of the Combi-Carrier, so you need to either bend the legs, which is preferred, or leave them straight if you need to, but you'll have to have 2 providers lift at the bottom corners or somebody's going to get kicked in the groin. Anyway, the person who's back to us has the job of making sure the patient doesn't roll backwards off the board during the lift. Also, he's holding the patient's head to minimize movement. Preferably the board is lifted straight up and the stretcher is slid underneath. Any required movement any distance and the patient should be strapped onto the Combi-Carrier. Now, note placement of the Combi-Carrier off the head of the stretcher to make sure the patient's head is positioned correctly. We want to separate the halves. Someone's going to control the head, and then we're going to consider using some tension on the draw sheet, and we're going to smoothly pull the halves away simultaneously. You're going to release your patient's head. You're going to tuck your draw sheet out of the way. Place a pillow or 2 behind the patient's legs for additional support, and apply the stretcher straps, which we'll go over that part in another video.